really hard nuts to crack. And so some of you are probably in the midst of these things as well. And we're going to have to just learn our way through this. We will have to experience the way the system works or doesn't work, and figure out how we can make a safer, better internet while preserving all of its value, but inhibiting as much of the harmful behaviors that we can see. So now I want to turn to one last thing, and then Q&A if you're interested. In 1998, where I ended this little history, well, in 1997, just before 98, the Pathfinder mission landed successfully on Mars. Now, some of you will remember that the Viking missions landed in 1976. There were 2 Vikings, and it was a dramatic, successful landing. Data got sent back. There was even some hint that they had detected some biological molecules which might have been generated biologically. So there's a lot of excitement over the possibility of finding life on Mars. That never quite got sorted out. And then nothing worked for 20 years. It missed the planet, it crashed on the hill, and went burned up in the atmosphere. So in 1997, it was a big deal that the Pathfinder landed successfully. There was a little rover called Sojourner. And I got so excited about the successful mission that I flew out to JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, to meet with the comms team. And we were finishing each other's sentences in about 30 seconds. And then we asked ourselves in 1998, what should we be doing now, in 98, to be ready for what we will need 25 years later? Well, here it is, 25 years later. What has happened is that over that period of time, we have developed a whole new suite of protocols that can work in deep space. TCP/IP does not work well with a 40-minute round trip time. Just do the math. Speed of light is too slow. Between Earth and Mars, when we're closest together in our respective orbits, it's 35 million miles. That takes about 4 minutes at the speed of light to transmit, and of course 4 minutes back. When we're farthest apart in our orbits, it's 235 million miles. That takes 20 minutes at the speed of light to send a signal to Mars, and another 20 minutes to come back. So the TCP protocols were originally designed for like half-second round-trip time or less. You know, ping is a little thing, you send a note and you get a little response back. If the ping isn't going to come back for 40 minutes, it's not clear how valuable that piece of information is. So we developed a whole new suite of protocols that we call the bundle protocols. And, well, actually So I just want to tell you just a teeny bit about that, and then we'll do some Q&A, and then I have to run off to the train station. I want you to think for a minute. We thought maybe we could make TCP/IP work on Mars. It worked on Earth, so what's the problem? And it probably would work on Mars. But then when we started doing the math, we had, flow control. So how does TCP do flow control? It's really simple. When you start to run out of room on the receiving end, you send a packet to the other guy saying, I'm running out of room, would you please slow down or stop? Well, if it takes 20 minutes for the guy to hear that signal, he's going to be pumping data at you at max rate for the 20 minutes, and they're all going to fall on the ground. So that didn't work. How about domain name lookups? When you type something into a browser, it usually has a domain name in it, like www.google.com. That has to be transformed into a numerical IP address. And there's a system, a distributed system called the domain name system, that lets your software look that up, get a number back, an address, and then use that to open the TCP connection. Well, imagine you're on Mars, and you're trying to place a call to Earth, and it's going to take 40 minutes to get an answer back. Well, in today's Earth, the IP address might change if you're moving around, which a lot of us are. And so by the time you get the answer back, it's wrong. And so that didn't work. Oh, and there's another problem. The planets are rotating, and we don't know how to stop that. So if you got something on the surface and the planet's rotating, you have to wait till it comes back around again to communicate with it. So we have a variably delayed and disrupted communication environment. So we decided this was a new category of networking we call delay and disruption tolerant networking. We developed a new suite of protocols. We've been iterating on them. We're in version 7 now, which is stabilized. We've been, in 2004, while we're still working on this stuff, the 2 Spirit and Opportunity rovers landed on Mars in January. Another successful pair landing, which is phenomenal. The plan then was that we would transmit data from the rover on the surface of Mars directly back to something called the Deep Space Network. These are 3 locations on Earth, Canberra, Australia, Madrid, Spain, and Goldstone, California, with 70-meter dishes, 200-foot dishes. So they can detect really weak signals, and they can transmit honking big ones. And if you're trying to communicate with a small spacecraft with a small antenna and not a whole lot of power, you need stuff like that. So the plan was to transmit data from the surface of Mars and the rovers back to the Deep Space Net. And the radios on the rovers overheated. And so immediately the engineers said, well, we have to back off on the duty cycle. And it was only designed for 28.5 kilobits a second. So the scientists are, really grumpy. So one of the engineers at JPL said, well, there is an X-band radio on the rovers. And the orbiters that we sent 2 years before to map the surface of Mars to figure out where the rover should go are still functional. And they have X-band radios. So they said, how about we load your experimental software on the orbiters and the rovers. So instead of trying to transmit the data directly back to Earth, the rover waits until the orbiter gets overhead, transmits the data up, and the orbiter hangs onto it until it gets to the right pace in its orbit to transmit back to the Deep Space Net. Now, there is a nice little benefit from this because the distance between the rover and the orbiters is not very much, a few hundred miles. So they got 128 kilobits data rate up to the orbiter. The orbiter is outside of Mars's very thin atmosphere, bigger antennas and more solar power. And so they can transmit data back to the Deep Space Net at 128 kilobits a second. So store and forward networking, otherwise known as packet switching, worked better for them than the original plan. So that just demonstrated that even a small network had a big payoff. So here's where we're headed. In the 2030s, you already know the Artemis missions are underway. We're going to return to the moon. We've done 1 mission so far. There are 4 or 5 planned. By the time we get to Artemis 3 or 4, we will have people landing on the moon again. And so by 2030s, when we are also launching missions to Mars and other missions to the outer planets, we will have multiple spacecraft needing communication. And instead of using the Deep Space Net to point to these things one at a time, which is really time-consuming, we want to build a store and forward network a lot like the internet, which is just there and it runs. It automates everything. So that's the plan. That's what's coming in the near term. One last thing for all you lawyers in the crowd. I want you to think for a minute about what NASA has done. It has decided that it's going to allow commercialization of the moon in the following sense. They said, you want to run a communication system? We'll purchase the service from you. You worry about getting your equipment in place and maintaining it. You want to sell us some moon dust? No problem. We'll buy the moon dust, but you've got to get the mine going on your own. So they've already induced interest in commercialization of the moon. So now the question is, are you allowed to own a mine on the moon? And right now, the Outer Space Treaties of '67 do not contemplate private sector ownership. But if you could own it, where would you register it? And what if there's a dispute? Where would you go to resolve that? What if somebody tries to jump your claim? Where's the space police? We don't have answers to any of these things, and they are not 20 or 30 years away. They're 2 years away. So for people who are concerned about space policy, this is actually a very realistic and significant challenge. And oh, by the way, it's international, obviously, because we have partners in the Artemis mission, ESA, JAXA, and CARI, in addition to NASA. So this is actually hitting us in just a couple of years' time. I find that super exciting. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, and also happy to ask questions until I have to dash out the door at about 2 o'clock.
Good, thank you so much. Fascinating presentation, both past, present, future. Thank you for a very, very thought-provoking presentation. We do have time for a couple questions. Suzanne is here with the microphone.
Wait, let's go to the chair.
Oh, you've got, yeah. I do the running around like Geraldo.
Oh, okay.
This is my exercise for the, wow. My exercise for the day. So good.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. And thank you for inventing the greatest engine of human and social progress in human history. That's quite an accomplishment. So my question is this. So it seems like with AI, we've quickly rushed into a discussion of sweeping controls on technologies. We've got proposals on the table for licensing regimes, and innovation pauses, and restrictions on data centers and chips, and new regulatory oversight agencies. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't think anybody has a clue about how to do the regulation. I mean, from the pure, we understand the desire to keep people from being harmed in some way by the use of large language models or machine learning. But honestly, the technologists don't really know how you would regulate this, and I don't think the senators and the congressmen do either. I don't want to sound, well, how do I say this? The internet benefited from the fact that people realized that we didn't know what we should regulate, and it was thought to let it go until we could experience it and then learn the things that we needed to do. Now, we have learned that bad things happen, malware happens, social media happen. There are all kinds of issues that have to be addressed, and they are being debated right now, in Europe especially, but here as well. So I would think that we should just talk about not using these things for applications that are potentially risky. So it's one thing to generate stories. It's something else to give people medical advice or investment advice. So I would rank order the sort of the risk factors and say that there should be either limits on or additional scrutiny and maybe even liability for using machine learning tools for something that might have personal or corporate risk or even national risk, but not to try to regulate it in some explicit way. It's just too early. Okay, other questions? There's one way in the back here.
I'd be curious to get your take on what's going to replace packet switch networks. There was a lot of competition in the 90s with ATM and silent rings and other forms of networking, and obviously TCP/IP and packet switching won out in that regard. Is there something that is going to replace packet switch networks?
Not in the near term. What's happened in the packet switching world is that software-defined networks were the new revolution. That's more than a decade old now, but it gave flexibility to the design and implementation of stored forward networking in a very dramatic way. If there's anything that we will see emerge, most of you, I'm sure, are aware of the heavy investments right now in optical communications, fiber communications. There's huge growth in undersea cables. One transformation in the optical fiber world, if you look at the maps, they're mostly east-west. They're connecting continents together. But if there's a cable failure, we don't have any north-south cabling to work our way around the failures. And so there's some real interest in building a mesh that goes north-south as well as east-west and putting on the ocean floor wet switching capability. So that's a big deal. You have to power that. That's a non-trivial exercise. So that's one, I will say, small step in the direction of change and evolution. The other thing is optical free space lasers are also starting to show up as a very powerful alternative to optical fiber. It's not nearly the same capacity. Optical fiber is dramatic. But for certain cases, a point-to-point laser shot can be really cheap by comparison. There's also some work using lasers for inter-satellite communication in the LEO orbits, and LEO, of course, being another major addition to internet communication. But there's also some serious work on ground-to-space optical as well. And some of these are pretty impressive. Small 20-pound, 1.5 watt, 1.6 terabit per second optical transceivers, which are pretty exciting when you go up, to carry that level of traffic. So those are the things that are in the immediate likelihood. Some people keep hoping that quantum communication is going to solve everything, and that somehow or other there will be instantaneous ability to communicate because we send entangled photons to Mars, and everybody knows that the entanglement persists no matter how far apart everything is. Unfortunately, entanglement does not produce communication. It only produces correlation. And so it doesn't work to send entangled photons to Mars and hope that you can communicate. Some people are using photonic communication, though, to generate keys. This is quantum key distribution. And so that is happening. And it's gotten the attention of a number of places, including USA. So that's in the near term. After that, my crystal ball isn't any better than anybody else's, to be honest.
One more question?
Okay, we've got time for one more, yeah.
Could you expand a little more on the 6G conversation we were having before?
Happy to do that. We were talking a little bit about what's going on with 5G and 6G. I think I am not wrong in suggesting that the 5G efforts have not produced the kind of revenue generation that many people had hoped for, given the investment that was required. 6G is, of course, still in the offing. It's still being developed. But what we have noticed at Google is that the 5G and 6G architectures have components in them that are of real interest for enterprise communication. So imagine that you're building a factory floor, for example, where things are moving around, or you want to reorient and reorganize things. Wires are not your friend when you have that kind of environment. So if you could operate a 5G or a 6G system in an enterprise setting, that would turn out to be pretty useful. And oh, by the way, there's this additional spectrum for Wi-Fi. Well, you could use the 6G architecture in the Wi-Fi frequencies as well. So imagine using 5G and 6G and Wi-Fi frequencies in an internal setting, using the 6G architecture. The next thing that you might observe is that 5G and 6G, you have processing capability in what we would typically call the base station, although it doesn't have to be integral to the antennas could be separate. But the idea of putting processing power very close to the consumption is important for latency. So we were talking about the latencies at deep space network, and here we're switching to the other side. For control, you want low latency. So having an edge computing capability in the communication system is potentially extremely valuable. And it's funny to watch the pendulum going back and forth, because originally we had honking big computers that people could use in batch mode. Then we had time sharing, honking big computers that people could use multiple at the same time. And then computers got cheap enough so that every department could have its own, and hell with the central data computing. And then everybody got a workstation. Then everybody got a laptop. Then everybody got a pad. Then everybody got a mobile. And then mobiles and pads and laptops get looked at, and people say, you know, you can build a data center out of this stuff. So why don't we build honking big data centers again? Which they do. And now we're sticking computing in between the data center and the user in edge computing. So this pendulum is just swinging back and forth. I'm anticipating that the success of 5G and 6G will almost certainly come from enterprise kinds of applications as opposed to the kind of outdoor applications that we're accustomed to. So that's my response to the 5G and 6G. And I need
Well, thanks again to our very distinguished speaker. Fascinating presentation. And glad you're all here today. We'll see you again in November. We'll give you the time and date down the road a little bit. But thank you all for coming, and hope you enjoy this really extraordinary presentation. So enjoy your afternoon. Thank you. Bye.